Picture a quiet lake in the middle of Wisconsin, the water flat and silver in the early morning light. Now picture a truck driving straight off the shore and into that water without stopping, without sinking, without hesitation, as if the line between land and lake simply didn't exist for this machine. That truck was built to storm beaches under artillery fire. Within a year of the war ending, it was giving rides to tourists with cameras around their necks. How did a vehicle designed to survive Normandy end up as a novelty ride at a resort town, and why did nobody see it coming? You know the vehicle today by the sound it makes when people spot one on the road. Duck boats, half boat, half truck, fully absurd to anyone who doesn't know the history. But before it carried sunburned families past waterfront gift shops, it carried ammunition, wounded soldiers, and terrified young men onto some of the most dangerous shorelines in human history. This is the story of how one of the war's most unglamorous inventions quietly slipped out of military service and into American tourism, and how a surplus glut nobody wanted turned into a business empire built entirely on curiosity. To understand how strange this transformation really was, you have to go back to 1942, when the United States Army had a very specific problem. Amphibious warfare meant getting supplies from ships anchored offshore onto beaches that had no ports, no docks, and often no roads. Existing trucks couldn't swim. Existing boats couldn't drive. The Army needed something that could do both, and it needed it fast. The task fell to a small design team working with General Motors, including engineers from Sparkman and Stevens, a yacht design firm more accustomed to racing sailboats than building military hardware. Working alongside them was Rod Stevens and engineer Dennis Poulaston, figures whose names rarely appear in mainstream war history, despite the outsized role their invention would play. Time was the enemy from the start. Planners needed a working vehicle within months, not years, which meant there was no room for an entirely new design built from scratch. Instead, the team based their amphibious truck on an existing GMC six-wheel drive chassis already in mass production for the Army, adding a welded steel hull around it, a propeller driven off the main engine, and a bilge pump system to keep the vehicle from swamping in rough water. It was, in essence, an ordinary military truck wearing a boat's skin, an elegant compromise born entirely out of wartime urgency. The result was designated the DUKW, a name that sounds invented but was actually a straightforward GMC production code. D stood for the model year, 1942. U meant utility, amphibious. K indicated all-wheel drive. W meant dual rear axles. Nobody intended it to become a nickname, but soldiers pronounced it exactly as it looked. And Duck stuck permanently. The vehicle weighed close to 7 tons, ran on a 6-cylinder engine, and could carry roughly 5,000 pounds of cargo, or up to 25 soldiers, moving at nearly 6 miles an hour through open water and up to 50 on paved roads. It looked clumsy. It behaved like a miracle. Skeptics inside the military almost killed the program before it began. Early demonstrations were unimpressive, and some officers dismissed the design as impractical, arguing that a vehicle trying to be both a truck and a boat would end up being a mediocre version of each. The prototype struggled in rough water and proved difficult for inexperienced drivers to control at the exact moment when wheels met waves. For a while, it looked like the DUKW might be quietly shelved, another wartime experiment that never left the drawing board. Then came a single afternoon in late 1943 that changed everything. A Coast Guard patrol near the Massachusetts coast spotted a grounded ship, battered by violent surf, its crew stranded within sight of shore but unreachable by conventional rescue boats, which kept capsizing or being thrown back by the waves. A nearby DUKW, still technically under evaluation, was sent out almost as a last resort. It plowed through the surf that had defeated every other vessel, reached the stranded sailors, and carried them safely back to shore. Witnesses who had doubted the vehicle only hours earlier watched it do something no purpose-built rescue boat could manage. The report reached Washington within days, and skepticism evaporated almost overnight. From that moment forward, production accelerated dramatically. Factories that had been building the vehicle in modest numbers shifted into high gear, and by the time production ended, more than 21,000 DUKWs had rolled off assembly lines across the country, built not only for American forces, but shipped to Allied nations as well. What had nearly been cancelled as an impractical curiosity became one of the most quietly indispensable vehicles of the entire war. They proved essential almost immediately. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, DUKWs ferried artillery shells, food, and fuel from ships anchored offshore directly onto beaches that had no functioning port facilities, an operation where traditional landing methods struggled against difficult terrain, and where every hour of delay meant soldiers ashore fighting without adequate supply. Commanders who had approved the vehicle only reluctantly watched it solve a logistics problem that had plagued amphibious operations since the war began. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, DUKWs carried artillery pieces, ammunition crates, and wounded men across the churning waters off Normandy, operating under direct fire in conditions that would have swamped or stranded an ordinary truck within minutes. Some carried supplies onto Omaha and Utah beaches during the most dangerous hours of the invasion, when German gun emplacements still commanded the shoreline, and every vehicle on the sand was a target. Later that same year, DUKWs supported the crossing of the Rhine, ferrying troops and equipment across one of the war's last major water obstacles, standing between Allied forces and the heart of Germany. In the Pacific theater, the story was equally dramatic. On coral atolls and volcanic islands where conventional docks simply didn't exist, DUKWs hauled ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly from transport ships onto beaches still under fire from entrenched Japanese positions at places like Tarawa, Saipan, and later Okinawa. Forward units depended on that steady flow of supply to keep fighting, and in many cases the amphibious truck was the only vehicle capable of bridging the gap between ship and shore fast enough to matter. General Dwight Eisenhower would later credit amphibious trucks among the pieces of equipment that shortened the war, placing the humble DUKW in surprising company alongside the bulldozer, the Jeep, and the C-47 transport plane. And then, almost overnight, none of that mattered anymore. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan followed in September. Factories that had been running around the clock, building tanks, trucks, and amphibious vehicles suddenly had no war left to supply. Soldiers who had spent years overseas wanted nothing more than to go home, and the massive machine of American war production had to figure out, almost instantly, what to do with everything it had built. The scale of the surplus problem was almost impossible to grasp. Warehouses overflowed. Airfields became parking lots for aircraft nobody needed anymore. And scattered across ports, training bases, and staging areas in the United States and overseas sat thousands of amphibious trucks that had outlived the war they were built to fight. The government's solution was the same one used for nearly every category of leftover military hardware. Sell it, and sell it fast, through the War Assets Administration, an agency created specifically to liquidate the staggering inventory of a nation that had just finished building the largest military machine in history. Storage yards from California to Virginia held row after row of amphibious trucks that had once been considered priceless tools of invasion and were now simply taking up space that the government needed cleared. Maintenance crews that had once serviced these vehicles for combat readiness were reassigned or discharged, and the DUKWs sat exposed to weather, slowly losing whatever value they still had with every month that passed. DUKWs, like bombers, jeeps, and landing craft before them, were auctioned off at a fraction of their original cost, sometimes for a few $100s, to whoever showed up with cash and a plan, a staggering markdown from a vehicle that had cost the government several $1,000s to build only a few years earlier. Farmers bought them to haul equipment across flooded fields. Construction companies bought them to move materials across rough terrain that swallowed ordinary trucks. Fishing operations bought them because a vehicle that could drive straight into the water and back out again solved problems that no boat trailer ever could. And in a handful of cases, men with far stranger ideas bought them too, men who looked at a machine built for war and saw something else entirely. The answer to a tourism problem nobody else had thought to solve. One of those men was Melvin Flath, known to nearly everyone as Mel, a boat operator working the Wisconsin Dells, a scenic stretch of sandstone cliffs and winding river carved by the Wisconsin River over thousands of years. Flath ran conventional boat tours through the Dells before the war, guiding sightseers past towering rock formations that had drawn tourists to the region since the late 1800s. But he had noticed something about the terrain that conventional boats couldn't solve. Certain rock formations and narrow channels were only reachable by land, others only by water, and no single vehicle could show tourists both without stopping the tour, unloading everyone, and switching transportation halfway through the trip. It was an awkward, inefficient way to run a business, and Flath had spent years looking for a better solution without finding one. Then, sometime in 1946, Flath heard about a strange military surplus vehicle sitting unused at nearby storage depots, a truck that could drive on land and float on water without ever stopping to switch modes. It sounded almost too unusual to be real. He tracked down several surplus DUKWs, still painted in military drab, and had them refitted for civilian passengers, adding simple bench seating and stripping away wartime equipment mounts that no longer served any purpose. In 1946, he began offering combination land and water tours through the Wisconsin Dells, letting passengers ride straight from paved roads down a boat ramp and into the river without ever leaving their seats. Tourists had never seen anything like it. The vehicle that once braved German gun emplacements on the coast of France, that had carried wounded soldiers off invasion beaches under artillery fire, was now gently splashing into a quiet Midwestern river, while a driver narrated local rock formations through a hand microphone. Children pressed their faces against the sides to watch water rise up around the tires. Parents who had served overseas sometimes recognized the vehicle immediately and told their families exactly what it had once been used for, turning a simple sightseeing ride into an unexpected history lesson. The business succeeded far beyond anything Flath could have expected. Word spread. Newspapers ran photographs of the strange amphibious trucks gliding into the water in front of stunned families. Within a few years, Wisconsin ducks became one of the defining attractions of the Dells, and Flath's operation grew from a handful of surplus vehicles into a fleet, carrying passengers on a route that remains largely unchanged to this day. What happened next surprised almost everyone who had written off the DUKW as obsolete. Other entrepreneurs across the country noticed the success in Wisconsin and began hunting for their own surplus amphibious trucks, and over the following decades, the idea spread far beyond a single river town in the Midwest. Boston Duck Tours launched its own fleet years later, driving tourists past Beacon Hill and the Public Garden before splashing directly into the Charles River, an idea that seemed almost as improbable to Bostonians in the 1990s as it had to Wisconsin tourists in 1946. Philadelphia followed with duck boats winding past Independence Hall before entering the Delaware River. Seattle launched its own fleet touring past the Space Needle and into Lake Union. Branson, Missouri built an entire tourism identity partly around its duckboat fleet touring Table Rock Lake. San Francisco, San Antonio, and cities across the country followed with their own versions, each one relying on the same basic surplus military hardware, or later, replica vehicles built to the same amphibious principle, that the government had been desperate to unload only a few years after the war ended. Vehicles once destined for scrap yards or forgotten storage lots instead found themselves painted in bright tourist colors, fitted with canopy roofs and speaker systems, and driven by guides cracking jokes about local history while steering a 7-ton military relic into open water. What had been surplus nobody wanted became, city by city, the foundation of a distinctly American style of tourism, one built entirely on the novelty of a vehicle nobody expected to survive the war, let alone outlive it by 8 decades. The mechanical bones underneath rarely changed. Original GMC engines, axles, and hull designs remained largely intact for decades in many tour fleets, a remarkable testament to a vehicle originally engineered for a 5-year service life during wartime emergency. Some tour operators ran their original surplus DUKWs well into the 1990s and even the 2000s before retiring or replacing them. Decades longer than the engineers who designed them under wartime pressure could possibly have anticipated. But the story carries a somber undercurrent as well. As DUKWs aged into their 6th and 7th decades of service, several tragic accidents drew renewed scrutiny to vehicles that had never been designed with modern passenger safety standards in mind. Incidents involving aging fleets in different cities prompted investigations, temporary shutdowns, and in some cases permanent retirements of specific vehicles, forcing operators nationwide to confront the uncomfortable reality that they were running 70-year-old military hardware carrying paying customers. Some cities responded with stricter inspection requirements. Others transitioned toward specially built replica vehicles designed to look like the original DUKW while incorporating modern safety features the wartime engineers never considered. Despite that, the surviving originals remain minor celebrities in their own right. Military vehicle collectors prize authentic surplus DUKWs, spending years and considerable sums restoring them to running condition, tracking down period-correct engines, hull hardware, and even original paint specifications to bring a 70-year-old amphibious truck back to the exact condition it left the factory in. These restored vehicles appear at historical reenactments and military vehicle rallies, sometimes rolling alongside the very jeeps, half-tracks, and armored cars they once shared assembly lines, supply convoys, and invasion beaches with decades earlier. For a few hours at these events, the DUKW returns to something closer to its original identity, mud-splattered and olive drab, before returning home to a garage or a museum floor. Museums, including collections dedicated to World War II amphibious warfare, keep restored examples on permanent display, often positioned next to photographs of the same model of vehicle unloading supplies onto invasion beaches, letting visitors connect the peaceful machine in front of them to the chaos it once drove through. Military history collections in Louisiana, Virginia, and several other states maintain operational DUKWs specifically to demonstrate amphibious capability at public events, giving new generations a chance to watch the transition from road to water that once amazed soldiers and tourists alike. In an odd twist of fate, some of these museum vehicles occasionally get loaned out for parades or ceremonial functions in the very same coastal towns their sister vehicles helped liberate 80 years earlier. Looking back, the DUKW's post-war journey says something larger about how nations absorb the aftermath of total war. Equipment built for annihilation doesn't simply vanish once the fighting stops. It gets sold at auction for pennies on the dollar, repurposed by farmers and fishermen who never gave a second thought to its wartime record, and in the strangest cases, reborn as entertainment, carrying grandchildren of the soldiers who once depended on it through the same kinds of rivers and harbors those veterans might have trained beside decades earlier. The half-tracks became scrap metal. The Sherman tanks became target practice or monuments outside American Legion halls. But the DUKW, alone among nearly all its wartime peers, found a second career that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with joy, ferrying laughing families instead of frightened infantrymen, and somehow thriving in that new role for longer than anyone could have predicted. Few visitors climbing aboard a duck boat today, laughing as the vehicle splashes into open water, ever stop to consider that they're riding in a direct descendant of a machine that once carried ammunition onto the beaches of Normandy under artillery fire, or ferried wounded Marines off a Pacific atoll while the fighting was still going on a few hundred yards away. The tour guide's jokes about local landmarks are, in their own strange way, standing directly on top of one of the war's quietest and most unlikely success stories. That, perhaps, is the quietest twist in this entire story. A vehicle engineered for the deadliest invasion in modern history became, within a single generation, synonymous with family vacations and gift shop souvenirs, its wartime past reduced to a fun fact a tour guide mentions halfway through the ride. The next time you see one of those strange amphibious trucks splashing into a river or harbor, remember what it once carried and where it once had to go. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, make sure you're subscribed, because the next untold story from the war's aftermath is already waiting, and it involves a piece of military hardware that ended up somewhere even stranger than a tourist attraction.